Welcome, everyone. I'd love to give you a brief overview of my guest today and the reason why we are here. Four chapter leaders from three chapters of the American Marketing Association, Cincinnati, PDX, and New York, came together to explore an important question: what is marketing's role in creating an inclusive culture? The answers and many questions came from 25 CMOs that were part of a confidential focus group. Their thoughts and ideas are summarized in a 42-page report and bolstered by a series of discussions we are having with chief diversity officers on their roles and how the offices of the CDO and the CMO can partner in advancing the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And with that, I would like to introduce you to my guest today, Marisa Grimes. Marisa is the Chief Diversity Inclusion Officer for the United States Tennis Association. In this role, Marisa is responsible for working with all levels of the organization and the tennis ecosystem to elevate inclusiveness and equity and ensure the USTA fulfills its mission of growing the game by bringing new generations of diverse players and providers to this sport. Prior to this role, Marisa led inclusion and diversity for MasterCard in North America, where she also spent several years as part of MasterCard's global communications team, spearheading communications initiatives for a variety of business areas, including the Center for Inclusive Growth. Prior to that, Marisa held key roles at Nielsen, TV Guide, and Discovery Communications. Now, I didn't read your entire resume because it's quite impressive. But I just want to take a moment to say thank you for being here and kick us off with you just telling us a little bit about like your journey and your company and just your journey into this current role, which I know is relatively new for the USTA.
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, for having me. Yes, so I joined the USTA about 10 months ago. So the USTA is the national governing body for tennis in the US. So we are responsible for the growth and sustainability of tennis in the country, everything from amateur and grassroots level all the way up to professional tennis. So my role as the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, I look at it as being twofold. One, it's to create a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable organization among USTA staff and volunteers. And it's also to create a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable sport among players, coaches, officials, really everyone within the tennis ecosystem. So my journey here, well, first, I think, you'll find that not a lot of people who are currently in D&I started out that way. Many were either plucked from business roles in their organizations and asked to lead D&I efforts, or like me, they sort of made a gradual shift into it. I would say diversity and inclusion has always sort of been part of my world, even going back as far as to college, the organizations I was involved with, the volunteer work I did. It was always sort of on the periphery of my career once I moved into my career in PR and communications. And I think I was always particularly interested in working with underserved kids. But it wasn't really until I would say I had kids of my own that I started focusing more heavily on this work. When my first son reached school age, he's 12 years old now. But when he was first starting school, my husband and I were looking at schools for him and realized that there's still such a huge disparity in the quality of schools and education, particularly for kids of color. And so I started, just looking more into why that is the case. And then that led me to writing about it for a few different blogs. And then I really just started looking for ways to have more of a direct impact on these issues. And that eventually led me into my D&I role at MasterCard, and then now here at the USTA.
That makes so much sense, right? That people kind of meander into this role, and it's for a lot of organizations, it's brand new, right?
Right.
So it's developing its voice, it's developing its vision. And I think other departments also have to learn how to work with and integrate with, the chief diversity officer, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that's exciting though, right? Because it's so brand new, you can kind of shape it right the
Yeah.
way that you want. But at the
Yeah.
same time, there's so much weight that's placed on it and its success. And
Mhm.
so it has like this double-edged sword to it, you know, in effect. But like even in the report that we put together, you know, majority of the participants, like 42% said that they had a dedicated, you know, chief diversity officer role.
Mhm.
But you know, the rest were actually either working on it or that wasn't part of the organization. So I love to see this trend, you know, going in the upward motion. So when you think about, you know, DEI for the USTA, or even, you know, when you're at MasterCard, like what did you find were some of the typical challenges within the organization that,
Mhm.
you know, just employees or just institutions just need to kind of think about? Any trends there?
Yeah. So I think, a lot of times organizations that have had a DNI department for quite some time, while, you know, especially I'm, thinking about MasterCard in particular, where a lot of great progress has been made. We've been focused on DNI for, quite some time. A lot of organizations have found, right, that because the DNI departments were sort of centralized in the organization, a lot of times the ownership and accountability for making progress on the DNI goals stopped there at the DNI department and weren't necessarily embedded throughout the organization. And so now I think there's this shift, and one of the things that I'm really trying to focus on at the USTA is making sure that DNI is not just the responsibility of the DNI department, that it really is embedded throughout everything that we do in the organization, that everyone feels accountable, takes ownership of it, and that it really is part of the way that we operate and part of the structure of the organization. So even just, one of the things that I did, when I first joined in January, is that we established DNI goals, for the entire organization, and tied them to compensation for every employee. So, everyone has some skin in the game. We have organization-wide goals around increasing diverse tennis participation, especially to get more people of color into the sport. But then we also have individual goals based on an individual's role within the organization. So that could be around diverse hiring, diverse supplier spend. It could be tied to DNI training and education. And this is really the first time that the USA has had DNI goals for the entire organization. And that's something that we're going to look to continue to build on and evolve, because as we really look to expand and grow our strategy around the various opportunities that we have from a DNI space, I want to make sure that it's not just my team, it's not just me who are driving these initiatives forward, that it's everyone throughout the organization who's driving them.
You know, that's really interesting. You know, I've been hearing more and more that D&I goals are tied to compensation, right? And that's, you know, I've heard the debate that, you know, why should you have to really incentivize people to do it? But, you know, the argument is, well, if you didn't have to, it would have been done already, right? So I would love to hear just a little bit more about how, you know, senior management, you know, evaluated that opportunity, and, you know, just how did you respond to any feedback? That would just be great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is very interesting, and thinking about tying those goals to compensation, right? Just like you would if D&I really is truly part of your organization's mission and embedded in the strategy of the organization, why not tie D&I goals to compensation just like you do other strategic goals for the business, right? And so it really, when I came in the door, one of the first things I said was that I wanted to make sure that we embedded those goals in the organization, that they were tied to compensation for senior leadership. Actually, we started there.
Got it.
Senior leaders should be accountable. Managers, maybe directors and above, should be accountable for driving those goals. And so that's really where the conversation started. But then as we talked more about it, again, like at any level of the organization, you can impact D&I. And so that's when we really, took a step back and said, well, let's think about what everyone in the organization, no matter where they sit, no matter what their role is, what can they do to help advance this work and make sure that they have some ownership and accountability around it as well. And, I think for it being the first year, it was very well received in the fact that we were taking this step and really being committed to making sure that everyone played a part in it. But it also has to continue to evolve, right? Because I think, as we continue to grow and develop our strategy, those goals are going to have to grow and evolve. So this was an initial first step, which I think was an important one for us to take as an organization. And so we'll see where this goes next year and how we continue to evolve those.
Yeah, and I think that was super smart, right? Just starting with the executive leadership, because, from a lot of the conversations I've had also, and also the feedback from the survey is that, there are a lot of people that do want to do the good work of D&I, right? That sit in the middle, but they don't know how far they can take it. They don't understand if there'll be rewards or repercussions. Like they just don't understand what the company's vision and mission around that is. So executive sponsorship around these things are really important in order to move that forward. So starting with them and demonstrating that commitment is huge.
Exactly.
Yeah. So as you think about your efforts, very few, I guess, benchmarks exist, right? How do you think about measuring that success?
Yeah, so for us at the USTA, when I think about how we're benchmarking our success, I break it down between the organization and the sport, right? So for the organization, we measure staff and volunteer representation. We look at our hiring rates, promotion rates, retention, employee engagement, all of those sort of internally focused metrics. And we benchmark our representation against the US Census population data. And that's how we sort of track our progress towards that. And so for us, it's about, more so about like setting targets, not setting quotas, right? It is really focused on how we're continuing to see measurable progress against those goals. And then similarly for the tennis participation side, we benchmark that against industry tennis reports and other sports. So, I would say it's not a perfect science. You can measure diverse representation in terms of hard numbers, but when you're thinking about how you measure inclusion and equity and things like that, it's more subjective, right? So it's really a combination of different factors and different metrics that we look at to help us determine the effectiveness of our strategy. And one of the things that I have really wanted us to focus on in this initial year that I've been on board is that when we're looking at whether or not our strategy is effective, I want to make sure that our strategy first and foremost is focused on addressing what we have identified as the systemic barriers to progress from a diversity and equity and inclusion perspective, because I think a lot of times we focus on specific programs and initiatives, and we look at how those programs and initiatives are performing, but we're not necessarily looking at the underlying systemic factors of what may be helping us or hindering us from really making progress. And so for me, it's about measuring the effectiveness against those barriers that we know have been in place that have prevented us from making more progress, even as we've rolled out programs and initiatives, to address some of the more immediate needs and seeing sort of those immediate tangible results. But it's really about digging deeper and measuring the effectiveness of that.
Yeah, it's a huge task, right? Like even you talking about embedding it throughout the entire organization, I can just imagine that means, even supplier diversity, obviously why we're here today in part 2, talk about the brand image and things like that, and all the other different departments in terms of what makes up the organization. How do you think, other departments such as marketing can help out? I can imagine that you have these goals, you have these targets. They may differ based on where someone sits in the organization, what the department is. But our belief here is that marketing has this amazing influence over the brand and by extension culture, both internally and externally.
Right.
Do you see a role for marketing in partnering with you on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the departments that I do work most closely with is marketing here at the USDA, and the same was the case at MasterCard. I think an effective partnership. Well, I think first, I actually last week had I joined the marketing team's sort of virtual offsite that they did and presented a little bit on our D&I strategy and the direction that we're moving in ways that we can partner more closely with marketing. And one of the things that I said first was that, it does start with looking at your own teams, the agencies that you work with, the partners you work with, the talent that you use to represent the brand, and making sure that those diverse perspectives are represented. And if not, if they're not represented, they need to be, but also, marketers can work together with the CDO and D&I teams, as well as HR to help address those gaps. But I really think that a lot of it comes down to how we are embedding those D&I best practices into marketing processes and practices. So it just becomes part of how you operate. And I stole a definition from Salesforce around inclusive marketing and just talked a little bit to our marketing team about the concept of inclusive marketing. And they defined it as it's creating a culture that reflects the diverse communities that the company serves. But it means some of the things that stood out to me where it means elevating diverse voices and role models, decreasing cultural bias, and leading positive social change. So those things to me, right, they go way beyond representation and making sure that we have images of different kinds of people in an ad. It's not just about the representation. It's really about being more responsible and intentional about how different kinds of people are represented, how they're depicted, the stories we're telling, the message that it sends, so that we are really actively decreasing bias and driving positive change through our marketing. And I think in order to do that, that does require a close partnership with the D&I team, right? To help each other understand what's important to the communities that you're trying to reach, making sure that you understand sort of the full breadth and the intersectionality of identities, because that's how we can make sure that we're representing them accurately and engaging with them authentically.
It's like what you said earlier, it's systemic, right? And baked into every single thing that we do, right?
Exactly.
And demonstrating that for the audiences so that they can see it and they can, celebrate with you appropriately in an authentic way.
Right, exactly.
So it just seems natural to me that the two areas would proactively partner, and and I'm glad that you are working with the marketing team on that. So you guys are already ahead of the game, even though you're just there for 1 year.
Yeah. It's been a busy year.
So lots of lessons from you.
Yes.
Oh, Marisa, I want to thank you so much for sharing your insights. I know it's just a few bites, but I'm sure the audiences will learn a lot from you, and I certainly have already. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Anytime.
And thanks everyone for listening. We invite you to download the report entitled Marketing's Role in Creating an Inclusive Future at amanewyork.org. And together we can use the power of our collective voices to outline the roles marketers can play in standing for and delivering on inclusion. Thanks, everyone.